Mike.
Hey, Aaron. What's up?
Just here to do the podcast with you, man.
Oh yeah. Guess that's why this mic's here.
Yeah, that explains this.
There's two mics.
Salem's Lot. We've been doing this podcast about that book, I believe.
Yeah. In fact, got one more to go. I guess we will be doing that today.
This is it.
All right.
So yeah, we did Salem's Lot Part 1 after we kind of introduced the concept. And that was basically introducing the town. Ben Mears, an author, going back to his hometown.
Yeah. Introduced a lot of concepts. Man, the beginning of the prototype of the main character being an author, the boy wonder, stories of a town, all sorts of prototypes began in this book.
Yeah, he built a whole small town with it's called Jerusalem's Lot. They just shortened it to Salem's Lot. Actually, the reason for that interesting story was his wife thought it sounded too religious.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and so that's where I guess he threw that idea and that they shortened it.
Good call, Tabby.
Yeah. He does have a story called Jerusalem's Lot, which tells the backstory of this. We'll be getting into that one of these days. But the main reason I bring that up is this town has a history, and he really puts that together in this book. And we kind of gone over that in a couple of episodes before this. One thing I want to make sure we do keep in mind that this is a vampire novel. And so when you mention vampire novel, you're always going to bring up Dracula. So we did go over that before and how this is,
I mean, it's just American Dracula in a small town.
Yeah. And so I did write on the blog a review for this in between this episode and the last one. And so if you want to,
Yeah, if you haven't checked out his blog yet, you definitely should.
I'll say if you want more on this than what we've given you, and this is the third episode, there's more over there. So if we don't hit it on here, and we haven't already hit it, there's probably something been mentioned about whatever your pet idea might be from this novel, because this is a novel full of all sorts of things that people could latch on to. Like you said, you got the boy wonder, Mark Petrie, super into horror stuff. We went over how he's pretty much the only character that was like, hey man, these are vampires. That's exactly what's going on. Here's how to deal with it. That's what we should do.
Yeah. I mean, Matt Burke, kind of, but you definitely can latch on to him either way, though. I mean, he's a great character. He's a great dude in general.
You mentioned the prototype. The King keeps going back to the idea of his whole trend of having the protagonist be an author, and that's Ben Mears. He also does a lot of teachers. Most people don't think of Johnny Smith from the Dead Zone. That was his job. He was a teacher.
He was a teacher till his wreck.
Yeah, and so you got Matt, and like you said, Matt Burke, he's a teacher. And so these are obviously things we've gone over before, but now that we're getting to the climax of this novel, that's pretty much what we're going to be covering here, the big major final scenes. But I figure we can kind of go character by character to bring us up to today's little segment.
All right, so if you want to discuss characters, we've already discussed Ben a little bit, but he's kind of the main character, so let's start with him. I mean, author, we've already said he's kind of the prototype of the author MC, but he's returned to his hometown, had a terrible experience as a child. Not all that terrible when you read it, in my opinion, but I mean, I guess.
I was going to get into the whole Marsden House thing. We can do that now, actually.
Go for it.
There's one thing I did notice about the Marsden House is a unique. Like I said, this is also a haunted house novel. It's a vampire novel. Spoiler, we've already been past that, but spoiler alert, there are vampires in this book.
I mean, this is the book review for the end of the book. If we're spoiling anything, you didn't read it, so
yeah. Yeah, so anything comes up, like, we'll just, this is not one you should be listening to if you haven't actually read this book. But it's a haunted house novel, but not really. It's a evil town novel, but not really. And that is something I as a writer, can appreciate that Stephen King did pull off, where he put that sense of dread over everything pretty early on by bringing in a character who did have a terrible experience at this house. Ooh, why this house? And so this house ends up, like, nothing really happens there other than the fact that some vampires live there, but nothing.
Everything.
Yeah. Nothing really happens there that says this house is haunted, because while Ben did have a, experience there,
he was a scared kid in a scary house, under pressure. Your imagination's gonna run wild. Most kids will have a scary story about some shit like that happening.
Yeah. And so while that is a question about the Marsden house that we'll get some more into later, with basically some final thoughts and stuff, but my initial thoughts about the Marsden house is, this whole, it's kind of a distraction to keep you not noticing a lot of the obviousness about the vampire shit going on.
Yeah.
By making you think something about this house is gonna happen, but nothing really happens.
Really,
with
it's
the house.
just the particular people or beings living in this house at the moment.
Yeah. And so Ben's coming back to this town because he wants to write a book about this house, and that's really why the house seems to be the focus. He wants to buy this house, but someone's already bought it, and that's Straker and Barlow. So with Ben being an author coming back, he's had this terrible experience that's, the reason he wants to write about the Marsden house, and that's really why the Marsden house is the focus. And so while it helps just cast this dread on really Ben's history, and that's where a lot of the eeriness from his portion of the story, why is he obsessed with this house? You get that story out of him, and from there, he, like we said in the last one, he doesn't really do much. He's a part of the search crew for the missing kids.
Yeah, and I'll give him the benefit of the doubt for the second part. I mean, he was kind of, in the hospital recovering for a big portion of it. Yeah. But still, I felt, honestly, once Dr. Cody kind of joined the crew, I felt like he was shining more than Ben.
I also feel like that Jimmy Cody, while at first he definitely doesn't seem like he's going to end up being as important as Callahan, but he becomes more important than Callahan, even though Callahan, we'll get to Callahan, that's a whole other discussion really, but he kind of surpasses Matt, and I think that's why Matt just kind of gets killed off screen. He's not even on the page. You just hear that that shit happened, and yeah, it's basically he's, his use has been, used up. There's nothing.
You're done. We don't need you anymore.
And then we'll get to some of those scenes in a minute, but as far as Ben, up to the point where we are in the story, we've pretty much covered him. He has a backstory with the house, and that's creepy, but then that whole threat, and maybe that's why I feel like Ben is kind of a useless character up to that point, because his whole backstory with the house and the reason he's there, that kind of amounts to fake. It amounts to nothing, because like I said, the haunted house thread kind of dies off, and you're more focused on the people living in the house as opposed to any ghost that might be there.
Yes, but what I do appreciate about it, though, is that it did two things. It did, one, it subverted expectation. You thought, this is haunted house, this is what this is going to be about. No, it's not. But more than that, it set the mood for the book. You brought up that it set this doom upon the book, for lack of better phrasing, because I'm not smart. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it set the mood for the book, and even though it really wasn't about the Marsden house, you felt that sense of dread from the beginning till the end.
like the example that I would use is kind of comparing the two TV movies that were made out of this book, and the one that we like, the older one, the 1978 one. They definitely kept the pastoral sense of the town, where it's like green and like, you know, it's very, I don't know, pastoral. Like you said, Peyton Place is like it's in like an idyllic small town tucked in these little valley. And the newer version, the 2004 I think version, the Rob Lowe version, is the only good thing about that version really.
He was
Rob
great.
Lowe. But we'll get to that some more later. But the difference there is like they tried to. You can't really capture, and maybe that's why this book is kind of a product of its time and place, but still feels fresh, is because that kind of small town vibe that you could get in the 70s and 80s don't really exist nowadays.
No.
But is also my main problem with we've discussed this before, and we'll probably do like a whole Blunt Talk episode about this, but that era, early 2000s, mid 2000s, most of those movies kind of suck because they all kind of have like that new metal Scott Stapp from Creed vibe to it.
Yeah.
And so, like, you know, we'll get more into that kind of thing later, but I feel like that's kind of the thing with, it's a gothic romance novel, and so the house is where the goth feel comes from, while the small town is supposed to be nice and pleasant. And because it's not the town that's dark, it's what's in the town.
Yeah.
But then you also get a lot of the smaller characters being quite dark. And I notice here is proof that Ben is a boring character, is we're supposed to be discussing Ben's character arc.
And we've discussed Dr. Cody, Matt Bird, Callahan, all the good characters.
Yeah, and so needless to say, like he does just kind of set certain things up as a character, as opposed to being, you know, a proactive character doing things. Just like our next character, Susan. She kind of is, like, there's really not much to say about her other than Stephen King at this point in his career, while he has written interesting female characters up to this point, it's really not his strong suit, which is why probably Carrie is super short and is written in like articles and in a different style where he didn't really have to put a lot of characterization.
He didn't know how to write her point of view.
Yeah, and so, yeah, he gets much better at this later in his career with like Dolores Claiborne and Gerald's Game and
Misery.
Yeah. Like he gets better really as far as the next book with Wendy Torrance. In the book she's like, we'll get to this when we get to The Shining, but she's a much stronger character than they made in the movie. We'll get to that. That's a whole conversation, but
Olive Oil destroyed her character.
We have the opportunity, like the capability, to have a good, strong female character. But one of the things I do mention in my blog post is that he seemed much more focused on getting his characters to where they needed to be for the plot to move along, you know, as far as, you know, the main characters. And I think the reason that some of these other main characters are so interesting is because they tend to be more focused on the plot. So it's a little bit of both, where his talents and skills at the moment of writing this novel were being focused more on, you know, building the town and having the plot move along and getting the plot points that he wanted to get, you know. But later on, his style changes where he's more just naturally able to tell that story, and so he's able to focus more on characters. Some people say he spends too much time on his descriptions and characterization, but
I love it, so I disagree.
Yeah. But at this point in his career, it seems that he's not so focused on that, and he's still learning the ropes of that, which, as a young writer, like, I'm not going to criticize that side of him. As far as a fan, though, I can see that,
he's not polished yet.
Yeah. So Ben comes to town, falls in love with this girl, Susan. We'll say more about them when we get to it, but our criticism so far has been that they don't really have a lot to go on until this next part that we'll get to here in a minute. But the other person that Ben comes and gets to know when he's in town is Matt Burke.
Matt, opposite. He's an amazing character. He's super lovable. Just a great dude. You want more Matt. Well, he's gone.
Yeah, he kind of becomes, apparently for King as a writer, quickly, easily disposable. He's clearly, like, you're clearly supposed to like him, but he dies off page. His death is kind of mentioned, and like, they're sad about it, but they kind of move on.
It is kind of set up. He brings up that he's had heart issues, and like, he's had a heart attack before, so he's in the hospital with it. They're they're monitoring him. But
it does fit in with like the whole mirroring with Lord of the Rings. He's clearly meant to be like the Gandalf. Your Gandalf dies halfway through too, so
that's true.
Like. But yeah, like
Gandalf came back though.
Yeah, Matt doesn't come back. Luckily, in this scenario, because
you do lose a character that does come back.
Yeah, we mentioned last time at the end of this last part, Susan is a vampire. So Matt's dead. Susan's a vampire. The company is growing smaller.
It's crumbling.
Yeah. As is the town, remember.
Oh, yes.
Everyone's dropping. Like, there's either they're leaving. And one thing I did want to bring up, but we'll get to this in a little bit, but I have something to say about Jalipsy as a character. And, like, clearly something I think King was trying to say about authority. But we'll get to that later once we're discussing certain things. But I guess the next character, one we kind of agreed was the best character in this book last time, Mark Petrie.
Mark, Boy Wonder. Yeah.
Another trope that King goes back to multiple times, and this one is one of the better ones.
Mark feels the most real of all the characters to me. And that's probably due to him being a child.
King is
that's the reaction you would give as a child, whereas everyone else, it's like, is this how I would react? I really don't know, but as a child, absolutely. That's 100% how I would react. Except maybe not try to kill it. I might just try to leave.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is the first time, Mark is the first time King really shows off his talents as writing kids. Obviously, once we get to
phenomenal at.
Yeah, once we get to It and some of those kinds of books, like, we'll really... But one thing I did want to mention about Ben before we get too far past discussing Ben, you mentioned how he's kind of useless in the second half, but it's not really his fault as he's in the hospital.
Yeah.
King does this in another book, Christine, where it's broken into 3 parts, much like this one. The first part is written in first person from Dennis's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's like injured in a football game. And so the second part is written as third person perspective, and it's just Arnie and Lee, and Dennis is in the hospital. He's literally not in this part of the story at all. And then the third one comes back, and
he's your hero. Like,
he comes back to Dennis as the main. Yeah, but it works because it does lend the sense of, like, this car's fucked up and something else is going on with this book, and so it helps. Much like with the haunted house and this book, it just kind of helps raise the tension. If you're like, what's going on with Dennis? Like, I need to know. Like, why isn't he here? Obviously, it's a tactic where King needed him out of the way for Christine to run wild. Anyways, we're not here to talk about Christine. We'll get back to Christine some other time. But it was one of those things where it did remind me of Salem's Lot in the sense where, like, yeah, for like your third act, your main character's kind of not really doing anything. But we were talking about Matt. Matt is also another prototype. Mark is a prototype.
Most of the main characters here are.
Yeah. But Mark is interesting in the sense that he's the one that, unlike Susan, goes to take out the vampires knowing that it's vampires and knowing how to deal with vampires. And so, Matt, I feel like he's kind of taken out of commission and then he dies off page. And it does, like I say, coincide with Jimmy Cody kind of taking over that part of the group there. And then they also bring in Father Callahan.
All right, so before we move on to Callahan, I want to throw out something about Matt, about his death. Actually, his scene, the death scene. So he's being visited in the hospital by a former student of his. Now, Matt doesn't even remember his name. That's how irrelevant this character is in this story. There have been already 3 or 4 other characters, like the bartender and other characters that have been introduced. You've got to only 1 or 2 pages with them, but you got a page or 2 to live with them, to learn a little bit about them. Not this guy. Just random. Didn't even get an actual name. It was like Howie or Howard. I don't even remember.
Not one of the characters that got like their own little sub chapter.
But what I appreciate about that is that to me was a very effective way of showing, no, this town's dying. This town's pretty much gone. The only this guy probably came up here to visit a teacher that obviously didn't give a shit about him because
it's the only person he fucking knew.
Yeah. Who else is he going to see? He wants to see somebody he knows that's alive. So,
yeah, there's something else I wanted to highlight though. Like before we move on to Callahan, is that because so many characters are dying, like even Jimmy Cody, who, while he does get the most brutal death scene in the whole book, like probably the best death scene in the whole book, that's pretty much all you can say about him other than he's Matt's doctor and Matt's dead. So like even in the cast of main characters, like that's one growing thin, and even some of like the main characters at the end, you didn't really know shit about them for the first half of the book.
No. His name was thrown out a couple times because, I mean, he's the town doctor, but
you didn't really have a scene with him until like halfway through the book. And that's kind of like what I like about that, is just that alone lends itself to the dread and the build-up of, like you said, doom. And like clearly this town is doomed. It's, as moving on to Father Callahan, it is damned.
Ooh.
And so Father Callahan, he was also much like Jimmy Cody, just named character. You didn't really get a scene with him until about halfway through.
Yeah, like I'd say probably about a third of the way through.
Well, I mean, he did the funeral. Yeah, it was part of the funeral.
But that was,
and you got a short little chapter before he did the
compared
funeral.
Compared to, like, I mean, come on. The Glick's dad flipped out and made a huge scene and kind of stole that scene. So like,
yeah.
He was just kind of there.
It was more that there was a funeral, and with a funeral, you got to have the priest. Like, that's really why he was...
You didn't get to know him.
I mean, you found out, like, he's drunk, so, like, it just kind of... That's another thing we need to discuss is the lot itself. Like, all of these characters we mentioned. You mentioned the bartender. Like, there's the school bus driver, who also has one of the coolest death scenes.
Oh,
the school bus scene with the...
Oh, man. Yeah.
The vampire children, like, coming
don't
to
be
play.
a dick to kids. They might turn into vampires and just ruin your life.
And then you get the whole subplot of the McDougalls, where she's like cheating with the fucking...
Oh my god, that is brutal.
Like, she's more villainous than the fucking vampires.
Yeah, she's trash. So is he, though.
I mean, like, yeah, like, that's the thing, is the whole town's kind of fucked. Like, let's be real, like... but there's some good people, too. We've obviously liked some of the characters, but... There's also a lot, like I said, she's worse than the vampires as far as being, like, you immediately dislike her. She fucking beats a baby. That's another thing of like all the vampire children when they come back, they always want to suckle, and like it's just like a disturbing little like, you know. King is also good at evil kids. He's good at writing kids, but he also has the specialty of the evil kid. Like he was pulling that off really before The Omen, really.
Yeah.
But so like the town itself is like we said, they're dying. But even before they're dying, like he did a good job of making that matter. Like so, you, like I said, you hear names, but you also spend some time with some of the characters. Like that whole McDougal storyline, it didn't really do anything but set up a creepy scene at the end where there's the vampire kid. Like
added nothing to the story technically, but it added depth to it. It gave you more
life to the town before it started to die.
Exactly.
And so that being the case, these two characters that kind of come fill the gap of Matt after he dies, and that's Jimmy. He dies off, obviously, like we said. So, other than that, Father Callahan, he, at the end of the last one, decides to, he's going to kind of have to be the light to the dark side over here, and he joins their little crew. And so, yeah, you have Ben. Susan's gone.
Yeah, and Ben's the one that had to kill her. He's finally a real man.
Yeah, like he finally does something. Well, yeah, the next time you see her after the window scene is walking down the street with Barlow, looking all mystical and magical and
kind of angelic for a vampire somehow.
Yeah, and so that was just one of those really creepy scenes. Where nothing's really happening other than like, oh, she is. Yeah, confirms that she's the vampire.
The imagery girl. I think of whenever I read that scene, like that's one of the images that really sticks with you in this book. Surprisingly, everyone knows, the window, and a couple other scenes, but just them walking down the road up to the deputy.
And obviously, we mentioned Matt or Jimmy Cody's death scene.
Fucking brutal. It's great.
Fall down the stairs. There's a bunch of butcher knives set up, and he man. I think in the movie, one of the movies, they used the deer antler on Mark's dad.
Yeah.
As kind of a replacement for that kind of scene. I guess that was an easier shot, but
yeah, but I mean that would have been just great too. Just cracking skulls real quick to drop them too.
So with Father Callahan coming in to join the crew, he's not necessarily the most deep character because, like we said, that's probably Mark, because you spend more time in his head with his thoughts as opposed to with Ben. You spend a lot of time in his head with his thoughts, but then there's not really much there other than the Marsden House stuff, which, like we said, kind of ended up going nowhere as far as anyway. But with Father Callahan, you get early on, alright, this is a drunk priest. That by itself is an interesting, I don't know, you could go all sorts of places with that. Where's this?
Why is he a drunk?
Yeah, why is there a drunk priest in this story? Okay, it's
I still don't know.
Vampire versus priest is one of those things, okay, that's an interesting, but it doesn't really come up again until here at the end of part 2. Going into part 3, he's joined the crew. He's one of the vampire hunters now. And then you kind of get this scene with Barlow. And you, before the scene with Barlow, you can kind of see, alright, not only is he a drunk priest, but his faith is failing him.
You see that early on, because this what we were just talking about a while ago, when his minor introduction, where he was in the giving the funeral.
Yeah.
Before you leave him in there, it brings up that he's questioning his faith.
I mean, yeah, but it didn't really delve into that.
You didn't realize how deep it was.
Yeah, and so I feel let's wrap up the story real quick, and then we'll get into that particular. But as far as where we were, they got to go deal with the vampires. They want to go to the vampire castle. Let's go find where the master vampire is. If we get rid of him, cut off the head of the snake kind of thing. And so this is where the Marsden house actually comes into effect as far as a real setting, other than just a spooky house with a creepy backstory. May or may not be haunted. I don't know. Ben is, like you said, he was just a scary kid, and that's really the only hint we get that it's haunted, other than some murders took place there.
Yeah, a lot sorry, I live in the hood, and a lot of houses around there had murders take place.
Exactly. So, but like we said, it was more of a tone setting thing, and in that sense, it was a success as far as my reading experience, anyway. But now they're going here. It's going to be the setting for the final battle, or so we think. Turns out
wrong again.
Yeah. While you have the scene where Ben takes care of Susan in the not so sweet and subtle way that he takes care of her, stake to the heart. The slaying of the vampire was a success in this sense, but Barlow's not around.
He ain't there.
But we find out exactly where the fuck he is.
Yeah.
Which is, by itself, a pretty cool scene. Just his entrance of, out of nowhere, burst through the window, starts slicing and dicing. That's a crazy, that's where we kind of get the idea of, these vampires as different as far. You've already kind of seen that they're different, but he does a good job of sticking to the vampire tropes and the traditional gothic romance style story, which I really appreciate. But up to this point, they are just, you don't necessarily get a straightforward scene of them. Okay, these vampires float. You get those scenes, and slightly different. The tone of the book and the setting and the time of the book is much different than your classical vampire books. But as far as the vampires themselves,
oh no, they're classic vampires.
They
scarier
until this point where you get more of a, like we had mentioned before, the EC comic horror.
Yeah,
where this is just where that vicious beast. I mean, you get that with the initial Susan attack, which is, that's a fun scene, and you get that these are, like you say, spookier, creepier, scarier vampires. But this is the first scene where you're like, oh shit, these are some brutal vampires. Because Barlow, in his, attack here in the kitchen of Mark Petrie, he shows some viciousness that you don't really get from Dracula necessarily.
No.
So yeah, Mark loses his parents in a vicious vampire attack. And this is the scene where Callahan has to show his
power.
Show his power, we'll get into exactly what that power might be later on.
He has to prove that he is in fact a warrior of the white.
Yeah, and we'll get into this a little more spoilery for later books later on. But as far as this scene, his faith fails him, which, in my initial reading of the book, even though you do get that prologue,
surprised.
Yeah, even though you do get that prologue, I was surprised by this turn of events where it seems that the villain is about to win this whole game.
Man, yeah.
Because the one that we were kind of relying on to be the one who could deal with it,
yeah, I thought
turns out.
Yeah, I thought Callahan was kind of the ace in the hole, and it ain't working out for him as well.
Yeah.
Not as well as I thought.
Yeah. And so Callahan, in this instance, gets damned, cursed. doesn't really turn him into a vampire like I was kind of expecting in the moment. And I was like, oh shit, like he's no.
That's cool though. It
does add a whole different
it changes it. It makes it there's something new here.
And like I believe we said in the previous one that he might have spent too much time with this character in this book. But that's from a specific perspective. And on one hand, the scene where he tries to go into the church later on and he gets like cast off by the church.
A lot of people think that the whole Callahan's ending in this book is too much. It's just out of nowhere. It's just a little too much. Just being extra. Yeah. I disagree. It's showing again realism. Like this is a real person dealing with this.
He's dealing with
this is how he is handling dealing with this, and not just that. It sets it up for. This is a character that's dealt with this that's going on somewhere else that I could return to later if I want. Obviously he did, thankfully.
I mean, then that was the general idea. The King had said for a while that he wanted to write a sequel to this. Like, pretty much like we had mentioned before, this was his favorite book that he had written for a really long time. Up until like the 90s and early 2000s. I think eventually he said it was Lacey's story that was his favorite, and I think nowadays he's saying that
probably something to do with Holly.
I was gonna say I think it was the Mr. Mercedes trilogy specifically that he really liked, but I also think 11/22/63 has been mentioned as one of his favorites, and so
it's like, I mean, you can't pick your favorite child.
Yeah, I'm sure Salem's Lot's still up there in his favorites just because it was for so long. But he wanted to write a sequel for it for a really long time. And before we really get into that idea, let's kind of wrap this up with any final thoughts about the ending of this before we move on to a more spoilery finish. And so at this point, like, really, like, let's wrap up the story real quick. You get, Susan's gone, Matt's gone, Jimmy Cody's gone, Straker's gone, most of your whole cast is gone, most of the townsfolk's gone.
Callahan's dipped.
Callahan's had to, and so Mark's parents are dead. You got Ben and Mark. And that does wrap around, to the prologue where the boy and the man are the only ones left from this town. But we'll get to that here in a second. But this town is full of fucking vampires, man. And that he does a good job of reminding you that, like, most people gone. At this point, you're really reminded, like, the cast of this book.
There's no one left.
I was going to say, like, 200, 300 pages before this, there's dozens of people filling this town. You know these characters at this point.
No.
And all of them, they're gone. They're either dead or they dipped.
One of the only characters that the main crew even talks to is in a flower shop, like 2 towns over.
Yeah.
That's how deep it's gotten. They have to go out of town to talk to somebody.
And that was a fun scene with, like, you get the perspective from the shop owner.
Oh, yeah. Strikers come through and bought out all these flowers. And it doesn't prove it, but it shows that it's very likely that he's gone to all the towns around that area and bought them out.
Mm-hmm. And so we've mentioned a lot of the best scene. Like, I just mentioned the scene with the flower shop owner and the way that he writes it from his perspective, so you get to see some of your characters. Yeah,
you get to see, like, man, this seems so normal while I'm reading it. Like, yeah, this is what you would do.
Yeah, but look at these wacky dudes in this car.
Like, whoa, man, why did a little boy, some dude, an old guy, and a priest just come in here? Or a doctor. It wasn't the teacher. It was the doctor. With doctor plates on his car. Yeah.
Why did they just try to buy all these flowers? Like, what is happening?
And why do they seem so distressed that there's no flowers?
And so, like, that was a fun little perspective shift in the story that really like it highlights these are vampires and this is what you have to do to deal with vampires, and
it kind of grounds you and brings you back to you've been wrapped up in this story, but this story's fucking ridiculous. These people are dealing with vampires, and it kind of checks you and brings you back to that.
And that was a fun little tactic that he used, and he does do similar things in some of his other books, but this is the first time where, if you're reading through his bibliography from Carry On to whatever the latest fairy tale or whatever the latest Holly book is, we'll get to some of that stuff, but that's another one of his prototype. This book is a prototype because that's another tactic that he uses to create better effect later.
Yeah,
with some characters we'll just dive away, further down our reading list real quick to the scene with Stan when he's introducing the adult version of Stan in It. It's all told from his wife's perspective, and you get 3 pages of her backstory. Yeah, and she is not a main character. She
is here just to let you know. Yep, Stan's dead.
Hey, yeah, and so, but that reveal scene only works because you know her and you've spent time with her and you got in her head and you know how she works. Yeah, and there's 2 whole pages of her standing outside of the door, hearing the dripping sound on the other time. Anyway, let's get back to Salem's Lot. This is just another example of that kind of thing where, who's this flower? Why do I need to know about this flower shop owner? But you get to see these characters from.
Anyway, point being, there's nobody left. Everyone's dying off at this point. It really does a good job of showing you, man, they're done. This town's done. It's gone. But there's still hope. They want to end this. So they're gonna go hunt down Barlow.
So before we start discussing some of our favorite scenes and some of our other things, we have this final battle, and they take out a master vampire. In a classic fucking way. They're pretty much the only way.
The imagery of dipping their hands in the holy water and just having those glowing fists, glowing hands to do this, that was dope as shit.
To remind you any glowing hand from a TV version of a much bigger Stephen King novel? We'll also be getting to that.
It's the one thing I don't like about that.
And probably a month, I would say, we'll be getting to some of that. But
we'll see.
We'll see where things go from here. We'll discuss that later as well. But anyway. Here we have the ending of this book where it's Ben and Mark, and we're kind of back where we began with the prologue of it. It's Ben and Mark, and they're pretty much the only ones that know about this crazy-ass town full of vampires. You would assume they're the only ones, but I would imagine.
There is one more. There is one more character that's figured it out by now. They run into the sheriff. Parkin Scalipsi?
Yeah, I mentioned to you I did have an idea of pretty much the entire point of his character is Stephen King's critique on the authority in the era of this book. This is, post-Nixon resignation. Yeah. Vietnam and shit's just dwindling out around this era. A lot of people have lost trust of the government. A lot of people don't know what to believe when the government speaks. And this is really that era where that was kind of already the case up to this era. But this is where even your modern...
It was a massive turning point where a lot of people that had always just kind of
accepted it,
been licking the boot of the government and no, these are our protectors, these are they love the idea, they idolized people in authority. This is where they kind of started questioning that that time in life, a lot of people did.
Yeah.
So it was a big change, and you can see it.
And I mean, that was a big point of a lot of this book, because obviously we'll get to this. Stephen King is one of those writers. His books they're not only about what they seem to be about. Like, for example, 11/22/63 on its face is about a guy who goes back in time to stop the Kennedy assassination.
But it's a love story.
Yeah, but when you read that, it's a romance novel. Like, it's a historical romance. And that's kind of one of those things King's always done. It's never what it seems to be. And one thing, this book is it is very political. Like we were talking about the authority thing, but it's also very working class novel, where I mentioned in my blog that most vampire books, especially up to this point, had been Victorian era vampires,
yes,
or aristocratic vampires, gothic romance, like, is very aristocratic in its sense. And he kind of brings it to small town America, but he also highlights the difference between someone like Susan's mom versus the McDougalls.
Oh yeah, big difference.
And it's not just a difference in characterization. There's clearly a class line going through Salem's Lot, and he highlights that without really drawing direct attention to it, but that he clearly has his opinion on some of these people, and he kind of lets that out, and it's not necessarily entirely, my style of working class, but you can tell, like, he has more respect for the bartender and the school bus driver than he does Barlow and Straker's furniture shop and the people who tried to buy stuff from there, for example.
Absolutely.
And obviously those are things that, return, the whole poor side of Derry versus, the other side of Derry. Or the even other side of Derry. But there's that through line through a lot of Stephen King where you can tell that class politics has at least been on his mind in the past and has left its mark in some of his characterization. And that's a fun thing. And this is, while it wasn't really shown in Carrie, that was more of a critique of like bullying and anti-feminist rhetoric and shit, but this one's more, I guess he does kind of critique religion a little bit in this one too. Susan's mom is not quite as terrible as Carrie's mom.
No.
But
she's still a bitch.
Yeah. So yeah, like we said, it's Ben and Mark, and they got rid of the main vampire, but
they killed the master, but
they're still in town swarming with fucking vampires.
It even says, like, on their way out, like, there's still the other vampires in the basement. Like, they can hear them and they see them, and so they didn't just die off from it. There's still a vampire problem here.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, our heroes kill off Barlow and get the fuck out of there. And they drive.
Ben is a real boy now.
He is. He's a real boy. And he takes Mark, and they go away. They go to a couple towns, bounce around, but they end up in, like, Mexico.
Yeah, that's where we meet them at the beginning in the prologue.
Yeah, it kind of circles back to there, where they spend time there, and, the priest comes out and talks to Ben a little bit, because he's been talking with Mark quite a bit. And eventually, Ben and Mark discuss that they got to go back. They got to end it for good. So they do. They go back and they burn the town. They just start a fire and burn that motherfucker to the ground. Respect.
That's pretty much the end of that novel. And so before we get on to some more spoilery section, we'll let some of our music play, and then we'll come back for a little spoiler section at the end where we talk more gunslinger, Dark Tower connections, but also I did mention the Gunslinger. Y'all should start reading the Gunslinger.
That's next.
That's next
we're
up
moving on to
list.
that.
But before we get to all of that, let us mention that Salem's Lot is mentioned in other books. It's still a location on the map after the end of this novel, and it does pop up like Pet Cemetery. Pretty much anytime someone's driving through Stephen King's Maine, Derry, Castle Rock, Jerusalem's Lot.
You're going to see those road signs or something, you know.
Stephen King likes to tease those things out there. But as far as this town goes, like we mentioned in the first episode of this series and the first episode of Salem's Lot, there are 2 other stories that we'll be getting to on our reading list that kind of sandwich this novel. And so there is more to Salem's Lot, but as far as this particular story, Ben and Mark are the sole survivors of this cast of characters. As far as, there are some minor characters that survive and they're off doing stuff, but as far as the main cast, they're pretty much the only ones left, except of course for Father Callahan, which we'll be getting to in the spoiler section because he shows up again in the Dark Tower books. And so we'll have fun discussing some of that here in a little bit.
And for our listeners that are have read Salem's Lot, are interested in this, but aren't necessarily committing to the entire Dark Tower journey that we're going down, but you would like to read these other 2 books that kind of sandwich this, check out Night Shift. The stories are Jerusalem's Lot and One for the Road. Now, if you're doing the Dark Tower read along with us, I would hold off on it until where we've put it in, and there's reasons for that, and you'll understand as you go.
There's a few books between here and then.
But if you're not, and you just want Salem's Lot, then I do recommend reading those 2 as well, because it's just more, and it's fun.
Yeah. And if, like you said, you're not necessarily into following along with the Dark Tower series, this book and many of the other books are standalone, and so much like we did with this one, we'll do, depending on how long it is, a couple of episodes discussing that book, and then like this one, we'll have a little section at the end of the final episode
where we discuss tie-ins, Easter eggs, what have you.
Yeah. We'll try to keep, other than, I guess, on the actual Dark Tower specific novels, that particular series is pretty much the only one where we'll just kind of free will discuss the previous books that we've discussed in a spoilery way.
Yeah.
But when we're discussing The Stand and Salem's Lot comes up, we'll try not to spoil.
And we're going to some. We're going to some because, it's us. Like we're not going to help. We can't help it. Sorry.
Yeah, it's hard to keep it entirely spoiler-free, and I personally don't really worry myself with spoilers as far as for me. And so it's hard for me not to be like, oh, it's like this, and then just spoil a whole book. But we will do our best to try to separate that so as not to ruin your experience. But just be aware when we're on the 3rd Dark Tower book and that's the episode you try to listen to, you're going to get some spoilers.
Absolutely.
It's just going to happen. But yeah, that's pretty much Salem's Lot. And so anything else we have to say is gonna either be super spoilery or we've already said it multiple times. And so that pretty much wraps up the discussion of Salem's Lot. So we're 1 book down.
We did it.
Happy birthday to me.
Yeah.
And so at this point, if you want to continue listening after the little ending music, you can. But if you haven't read the Dark Tower series, we're going to be ruining some of that for you. So if you're into that kind of thing, go ahead. But if you're not, then I guess we'll be seeing you next time on the People's History of Horror podcast.
Till then, keep it strange.
Signing off. So this is for the people who are interested in a little more about Salem's Lot as it pertains to the Dark Tower series specifically. And that is entirely to do with Father Callahan and vampires.
We said he'd return, and he does.
So if you're reading the Dark Tower series and you've already read it and everything, like I said, if you haven't, spoiler, I'm about to ruin it. But in book 5... Father Callahan shows up in Midworld with, he's in the town, and Roland and his quartet arrive and they meet him. And you get his whole backstory where, after leaving Jerusalem's Lot with his curse, goes to New York City, he kind of hits the road because he's kind of in between living and dead.
And we had mentioned that King had wanted to write a sequel to this pertaining to Callahan.
And that's pretty much what this is.
I believe this is why he didn't, is because he eventually took that idea and morphed it into him joining the quartet, and gave us the general idea he had of that story in Callahan's backstory he gives.
I mean, you could kind of see it as one of a shorter novel, because obviously those last several Dark Tower books are pretty hefty, like 800 to over 1,000 pages of novel.
Yeah, there's some tomes.
And the fifth one, where Callahan shows up, is pretty big, and you could kind of say like at least a third of that book is just Callahan telling his backstory and how he got there, and like how he's now involved in what's going on in this world and so on.
And so on and so on.
And a lot of that is also fleshing out Stephen King's mythology of vampires. And so where in Salem's Lot you got a master vampire with Barlow.
Yeah.
And all these little minions of his, basically, where other than Susan, none of them really seemed to have any kind of control over what they were doing. Even Susan didn't really, but she seemed a little more put together than, say, Danny Glick or some of the other ones.
Yeah.
But that's neither here nor there. With the Wolves of the Kala and Callahan's exploration, he kind of does end up being like a master vampire killer, which is cool.
Yeah. He becomes a slayer.
And obviously I'm not going to even spoil, where this goes in the Dark Tower series, but his backstory from Jerusalem's Lot to Colibrin Sturgis, is where the town where he ends up, is basically just killing vampires and learning that there's 3 types of vampires. You have the master vampire, the type 1. And you have the type 2, which is, I guess, kind of what Susan was, where they can control themselves, but they can't necessarily create other vampires in the same way.
They'll never be a master, but they're more advanced than your typical vampire.
And then, like, a type 1 can make either a type 2 or a type 3, but a type 2 can only make a type 3, and they just kind of end up being animalistic and just raging demon, like most of the vampires you find in Salem's Lot. Obviously, we'll get more into that once we get down the road to Wolves of the Kala. But I just wanted to bring that up where there really is a continuation of Salem's Lot within the Dark Tower series. And it's why I mentioned before, and we mentioned in my blog, that this is one of the major tie-ins to the Dark Tower series, because he didn't have to do too much explaining about vampires because there's a whole other fucking book.
He did it.
And this is also this is more spoilery to the Dark Tower than my whole little discussion with Father Callahan. But one of the ways that Father Callahan is introduced, and why he gets drawn into the quartet and is such a major character in the Dark Tower series, is that one of the books they discover in this bookshop where the owner is helping Roland and his quartet is Salem's Lot by Stephen King.
Yeah.
So at one point, Father Callahan is holding Salem's Lot in his hand and reading his own story on these pages. And so that's a fun, that's, you know.
Yeah, Dark Tower gets wild.
So, like, yeah, we'll obviously, like I said, get way deeper into that stuff once we get there, but this is kind of what I want to do with each non-Dark Tower book. At the end is kind of, all right, how does this tie in?
Yeah, we want to make sure y'all, we share all of the connections that we've noticed, at least the ones we can think of.
Yeah, as far as we go along.
Because a lot of his stories do, even if you don't have to have it, have to have read something to understand another story of his, a lot of it just makes it a richer story.
Yeah. And I'm not going to say necessarily you'd have to read Salem's Lot to understand all of the Dark Tower, but it definitely helps.
It does. And like you said, you don't have to read it at all to understand it, but it...
Well, I would say, like, Father Callahan is more of a character in the Dark Tower series than he is in Salem's Lot.
Yeah.
But without Salem's Lot, you wouldn't necessarily understand Father Callahan later on. Because, like, look at some of the shit that he's gone through. And the whole vampire hunter backstory wouldn't have felt as genuine.
Yeah.
If you didn't have
you wouldn't have really given a shit as much about, oh, yeah, you're a priest that hunts vampires. Okay.
Yeah. And so, but that's also just another example of Stephen King being able to effortlessly, or seemingly effortlessly, it's probably really hard, I don't know, just weave all of his books together in his world, and just the way, obviously in retrospect, when we can just read them all the way we want to read them, it seems fucking brilliant.
Yeah.
But, like, breaking it down in this way with looking at Salem's Lot and understanding, like, this ties into this much bigger world, it is also fun to appreciate, like, even by itself, this is a good little vampire novel, and the fact that it ties into this huge world kind of, gives it that much more little special shine, I guess. Obviously. Shine. Anyway.
Haha.
But yeah, that's the spoilers for you, and we'll see you next time.
Hey guys, so if you like what you're seeing here, then check out our page, like and subscribe, like this video, share. Check us out on Facebook. Anything I missed?
Yeah, I mean, we got the Strange Creation Facebook page.
Oh, I guess it should have been more specific.
That's Strange Creation Co. But then there's also the People's History of Horror podcast. And that's its own Facebook page. And soon we're going to be putting up Blunt Talk.
Oh, and your blog.
Oh, yeah, it's the People's... No, it's not. It's the Strange Creation Literary blog. And there's also... We're going to be soon bringing up an Instagram and TikTok and all the other shit, but we haven't quite got there yet.
We'll definitely be sharing those as soon as we get them.
But don't forget to go look at our Patreon page. It's patreon.com. It's Strange Creation Co. And we haven't really set up the subscription yet. We'll be doing that. And so either way, like, share, and subscribe. All of the things that we've mentioned.
Oh, and a big thanks to Laura.
And we can't forget Laura. She does all the media, pretty much anything you see on the videos. That's all her. We're just here talking.
This would be an utter disaster without her.
Yeah. So make sure every time shout her out, because she's the one that really does this. Thanks.